Alright, how's it going, yo? So today, we're going to be going over a really beginner's guide to getting the very most speed out of a Synology NAS. And this is going to be for people who do not have a super in-depth understanding and are really just kind of starting out and wondering why it's kind of slow at sometimes to access files and things like that. And I'll be honest with you, it can get a little bit complicated because there's a lot of different factors that come into play with this kind of stuff, because there's a lot of different ways you can connect to this, and some of them can be much more efficient than others. And so today we're going to be going over just some very basic tips and just overall understanding stuff on how to make your NAS faster. And this is going to be both for remote connections as well as local connections, because they are two entirely different workflows to getting the very most amount of speed out of your NAS. Also, if you like these videos, go ahead, like and subscribe and all that great stuff. We're trying to hit 100,000 subscribers. And the very first place we're going to start when it comes to a NAS is we are going to really be focusing on the local connection for these first 5 tips. And then we're going to move on to the remote connections, as in when you're not physically located in the same office, house, or network as your NAS. And start out, the number one tip for people who are connecting locally, as in you're in the same house or office as the NAS, is be on wired Ethernet with your device. This cannot be overstressed. How much of your speed really comes down to how fast of a network connection you have between your computer and the NAS. So before you do any upgrades, if you've got the ability to, get yourself a dongle that allows you to plug your laptop, or if you've got a desktop, it probably comes with wired Ethernet, and try to plug it into a network switch that is hooked up to the NAS. Now, for people whose NAS is right next to them like this, it's not too big of a deal. You probably have your router or switch somewhere around here, and essentially you're going to plug both your NAS and your computer into the same network switch, and then they're going to be able to talk locally. This is the number one thing that you can do, because it is going to allow them to talk so much faster, and no matter how good your Wi-Fi is, wired Ethernet is always going to be better, because wired Ethernet is stable. Wi-Fi, even if you can get fast speeds, is unstable. Packets have to be resent and things like that, which causes a lot of latency, which causes it to feel slow. And in pretty much any reasonable environment, you're always going to get a faster, better connection with wired Ethernet than you would talking over Wi-Fi. Now, while that works great for some people, a lot of people do not have a house that's wired for Ethernet, and their office is not in the same room as the Wi-Fi router where the NAS is located. And wiring a house for Ethernet, in some cases is very easy, but in a lot of cases is an expensive process and complicated depending on how the walls are and all that great stuff. But I want to throw out a couple of other things you can do to get a much better connection. And I'll leave a link to these down in the description below, but there is a thing called a coax mocha adapter. And what this does is it allows you to essentially send Ethernet over your existing coax lines, those TV receiver lines that you've got in a lot of walls. If your house is not wired for Ethernet, it may be worth checking out one of these things right here. Essentially, you have a little coax cable on each of them, and the way coax works is all coax connections in a house should be terminated in the same location if that's done properly. So basically, every coax is just wired together in one big old circuit. And so if you have a coax connection in both your office and wherever you've got the NAS, you can actually use this to get almost Ethernet, wired Ethernet speeds, especially just for 1 or 2 people. These actually work great. They are far better than Wi-Fi, and they're really easy to add on because they don't require you rewiring anything. It can just use the existing wiring. Some of them also do have adapters that allow you to still use the network for other things. So say in the same room that the NAS is, you also are using that coax cable for a TV receiver. Well, you can actually get a splitter here that'll operate over different frequencies. And so they actually can both operate at the same time without interference for each other. It's definitely something you want to test out and make sure, but this can be a huge saver, and 120 bucks pales in comparison of the cost to wire a house if you're going to get it professionally done. The other option that is not as good and a lot more error prone is what's called a power line adapter. So a power line adapter is a similar concept, except instead of using coax, it uses the electrical wiring in your house. And This can work, and it sometimes also cannot. So I would use this as a last resort if you don't have great Wi-Fi in the room you are and things like that. But this is one of those things that can work and is something to at least have on your radar. But it also can be fairly shaky depending on how the wiring in your house is and what breaker everything's on and some things like that. But it's just another thing to have in your arsenal of, like, if you really have to, you can maybe test that out. But those are two things that can make it so much easier to connect to your NAS with wired Ethernet without having to spend a fortune wiring your house or running cables just down the hallways. All right, so now that was a long-winded number one. Number two is actually pretty simple. How full your NAS is. And this really focuses much more on people who have hard drives in their NAS rather than SSDs. If you have SSDs in your NAS, it's probably fast enough, and it's very rare that it's the SSD's case, unless you've got very cheap SSDs. But hard drives really slow down the fuller they get. So where you first start to notice it, and it's a very small amount, is about 50% full. There, you can notice that they are not as fast as they were when they were empty. And then stuff really starts to get a lot slower at about 80%. I normally tell clients 70 to 80% should be the maximum you ever really stay at if you're looking for fast speeds. So especially for video production people, that is a speed killer, because when you're that full, the hard drives don't have the ability to really just get these large continuous parts of data that make it fast access. And so you really want to make sure you try to keep your NAS below about 80% full if you're trying to get your most amount of speed. And a really easy way to tell what's going on and why it might be slow is if you come into Resource Monitor right here on your NAS and click on your volume, hit the custom view, and this right here will tell you how busy your volume is. If while you're transferring files, this is 80% or more, it's probably the drives to blame. And you can also look at your disks over here to see what's going on. This is a bit of a special case because I am currently doing a data scrub and rebuilding a pool, as you can see. So take it with a bit of a grain of salt in this case, where right now my NAS is going to be fairly slow because the disks are just hammered as it's rebuilding the volume. That's just because I pulled it out to use it for a demo and now it's got to rebuild. But for most people, checking out the volume tab will tell you, hey, is it my drives being slow, or is there something else at play here? All right, so now moving on to number three for our local connections. That's where you're in the house with the NAS. This is where we start to talk about 10 gigabit and 2.5 gigabit Ethernet. So for those of you who don't know, there are really a few different speeds of Ethernet. Ones you'll actually see in use most of the time is 1 gigabit, which is probably what your network is right now. It has been around and pretty commonplace for the last 15 years. Is just anything you buy is probably built in 1 gigabit. Then there is 2.5 gigabit, which is actually something I really enjoy and I really like. I think it's a great balance. And then there is 10 gigabit, which is expensive and power hungry and a lot more complicated. And so this is the speed at which the NAS and everything else can talk. And I want to make something really clear here. This has nothing to do with your internet speed. Right now, we're only talking about local connections, so that's where you're in the same house as the NAS. And so in this case, your internet speed does not matter. You could have a 100 gigabit network and have your internet speed be off of a Wi-Fi hotspot off of your phone. The two do not rely on each other because whenever your computer is talking to the NAS, it's essentially going to find the fastest path to talk to it, and that is going to be the limiting factor. So if they're both plugged into a 10 gigabit switch, the computer and NAS can talk to each other over 10 gigabit speeds, meaning that when you're transferring files, you're going to be able to transfer them at 10 gigabit speeds, assuming all else is fast enough. When we talk about a 1 gigabit connection that came stock on your NAS, that caps out to about 120 megabytes per second. This is something that's really confusing because you hear 1 gigabit, and then when you look at a transfer speed, it's in megabytes per second. That's because whenever we're talking about networking speed, it is measured in a unit called bits per second. And we're talking about data and data transfers, it is in bytes per second. There are 8 bits in 1 byte. And so that is why they are a completely different unit. To get an easy ballpark figure for all of these, whenever you hear something in gigabits, just divide it by 10. And that's about the maximum speed you'll get when you're transferring files with that. So a 1 gigabit connection is going to give you about 120 megabytes per second, which is about the speed of a camera's SD card. A 2.5 gigabit connection can give you about 275 megabytes per second pretty reliably, and that tends to be a pretty good place to be. Then a 10 gigabit connection can do about 1 gigabyte of data per second, assuming all else is fine, and that is about twice the speed of a SATA SSD. So that can be very quick. So those are your basic figures, and to do these faster speeds other than 1 gigabit, you need 3 things. You need your computer to support it, and I really like looking at Amazon and getting these cheap 2.5 gigabit adapters. They are almost as cheap as 1 gigabit ones. They're USB-C or USB-A. They just plug right in and they just work. Then you need a switch, and then you need the NAS to support 10 gigabit cards. So currently all Synologies, as annoying as it is, they come with built-in 1 gigabit, and then some of them have the ability to add in a 10 gigabit or faster add-in card. This one has a little adapter on the back you just plug in, and you can slot it on in. You need to check your specific NAS model. And if you're routinely getting transfer speeds that are capped out at 125 megabytes per second, you probably want to look at upgrading that. Or you can look into a thing called SMB multi-channel. I'm not going to go over it super in depth here. I'll leave a link down in the description below to how that works. But that can actually use multiple 1 gigabit connections to get faster speeds. But that is the next upgrade to have, is if you are really transferring large files. And this is only something for people who are actually transferring large files. If you're only uploading photos from your phone or working on Word documents, this is not going to be a difference to you at all. You're never really going to feel it. Most photographers, the only time they ever feel it is when they're actually dumping data from their SD card. Editing in Lightroom doesn't have a huge effect. But for people who want to do video editing straight from the NAS, you definitely want to get at least a 2.5 gigabit connection. All right, so that is the summary of the network stuff. There is a whole lot of stuff there, and I'm probably going to go ahead and do an entirely dedicated video just on networking because it is crucial. And then the next thing is having enough hard drive to support it. So hard drives are not as fast as SSDs, and if you have a 10 gigabit connection, but only a single hard drive, you're not going to be able to saturate that really fast connection because the hard drive is just going to get full and it is going to get overutilized and it's just not going to be able to do anything else. But that's where a thing called RAID comes in and can make it way faster. So while one hard drive is slow, if you're combining the speed of 4 or 5 hard drives, well, now it's a lot faster. So if you're using SHR1 or RAID 5, adding more drives will make it faster. In general, to get about 700 megabytes per second, it's a good idea to have roughly 5 hard drives in a RAID 5 or SHR1 configuration. That's a ballpark figure, and you can sometimes get more speed out of that, but that's a good consistent figure that tends to work out pretty well. And so when you're using RAID, you're actually not reading and writing from one hard drive at a time. Instead, when you're reading a file or writing a file, it actually is reading it from all the drives except for one of them if you're using RAID 5, 2 of them if you're using RAID 6, because of that extra parity. And that way it's actually faster because now it's reading a part of each of the files from each drive and then combining all that together, so you're adding that speed. It can make sequential transfers a lot faster. Once again, if you're using SSDs, you only need about 3 SSDs in RAID 5 to saturate a 10 gigabit connection. And so that's only coming into play for people who are locally connected and also have already upgraded their networking to faster speeds. If you've got 1 gigabit, adding in more drives is not going to help you much at all. Finally, number 5 for local connections, before we move on to those remote connections, is indexing. So if you've enabled Synology Drive on a folder, and say it's something like a Final Cut library, where there are millions of files in there with a bunch of frames and they're constantly changing, Synology Drive is going to have to index all of those files. And when you log into the NAS, you might see that occurring. So you will see up here that drive icon constantly indexing. And that's something that can take a ton of performance away if you are having a lower powered NAS and things like that. So only ever enable Synology Drive for folders you actually want to use Synology Drive with, especially things like Time Machine and video production servers. You really want to avoid unless you need to. And another thing that's important to do is look at versioning. So right here we can see that indexing going on, and it's taking up a lot of processing. If you are somebody who has more than about 10,000 to 100,000 files, versioning through Synology Drive can really hurt your performance and be very slow. I very rarely enable versioning through Synology Drive unless it's a very basic company server. So I'm talking just a share where it's normal Word documents and that's pretty much it. Anything past that where you've got a bunch of media files and a bunch of stuff like that and thousands upon thousands, well, honestly, millions of files, that's where adding in versioning through Synology Drive can really start to take up a lot of space and a lot of performance. So I will often disable the number of versions for that for high performance systems and instead use snapshots, which in my opinion are much more useful for versioning and do not have any kind of performance overhead when using them because of the way they work. So that's where you can go ahead and if you do have versioning enabled, you can disable it here and then go into settings and hit clean up on your recycling bins. And it will go through and clean out those versions. Note, this process on a big file server that's got millions of files can take days to clean up all those versions. So do it off hours outside of time. Just be wary of that. But after it's done, you'll notice a massive performance improvement. All right, so that is it for our local connections. I've got another video on that kind of goes even more in depth for people who are really looking to get the most performance out of a 10 gigabit network. I'll leave a link down to in the description below, but that is the basics of it. Now let's talk about how to get better performance when you're connecting to the NAS remotely. And there are a few different ways you can connect to the NAS remotely, and there are a lot of different reasons to use the different ones. We're going to first talk about people who are using a VPN and standard SMB. So if you followed my OpenVPN tutorial, I showed you that you can just map your network drive in macOS Finder or Windows File Explorer and connect to files just like you're in the local network. This process is called SMB. An SMB is a Windows protocol that has been around since the late 90s, has been adapted, but it was never really designed for a high latency connection. A high latency connection is something like the internet, where it has to go over miles and miles of cable. It's got to go to different data centers just to get from your NAS to your computer. That's because whenever you're going over the internet, things take a lot longer than they do if you're only talking to things in your same local network. Hundreds or even thousands of times longer. And SMB was never really designed for that use case. And so when you're accessing files over SMB, over a VPN connection, it can be very slow. Now, for people who are just using regular Office documents, Word, Excel, and things like that, you'll hardly notice. That's because it's fast enough for those documents entirely, because we're talking about maybe a megabyte. But for people who are trying to video edit or edit photos and things like that, the performance can be unacceptably slow and incredibly frustrating to work with. And so that is the number one thing to know is that VPN connection, specifically with mapping a network drive, SMB, can be very slow for specific use cases. You're never going to have a good experience video editing over SMB over the internet. It is just not going to happen. And if you're trying to transfer tons of data, it can also be very slow in those cases. And so that's why number 2 is to actually use Synology Drive instead of SMB over the internet for people who need to have those faster access to those files, especially when they are large media files and things like that. So Synology Drive is a lot like iCloud Drive, OneDrive for Windows, Google Drive, all of those things where essentially instead of actually using the NAS as an external hard drive like SMB does, Synology Drive for Mac or Windows allows you to sync files to your local computer. And so now, when you open up a file on your computer, Instead of actually just opening up like an external hard drive on the NAS, it'll first download that file from the NAS to your computer and save it on your computer's local hard drive. While that first download will take a little while, depending on the size of the file obviously, every time you save and change a file and open up again, it now is just going to be using that local copy on your computer's hard drive instead of having to go round trip to your NAS every single time. And this can have huge performance benefits. It does come with some other caveats and things like that, but it is definitely something to look for if you're always accessing files over the internet, and especially if you find that the NAS is too slow otherwise. So I'll go ahead and leave a link down in the description below to that video that kind of goes over how to set that up, because it can be very powerful. On to number 3. This is a very key thing that can either make or break your performance if you are using Synology Drive. And if you're using Quick Connect, there are 2 different ways you can be accessing files via Quick Connect. Either using what's called a relay server or a direct connection. A relay server is basically a Synology server that sits in between your NAS and your computer and relays the data back and forth between them. It's actually encrypted through the server, so in theory, Synology cannot read any of the files on it. But if you're using Quick Connect instead of a VPN, and you're using a relay server because you don't have any ports open, downloading files first have to go through Synology servers, these Quick Connect relay servers that Synology has to pay and maintain. Now, this costs them money and you're not paying a subscription fee for it, so they throttle it very strongly. Now, if you're just using Synology Photos and Office documents, it's not a big deal. You're not really going to notice the performance slowdown of this. But if you're trying to download 10 gigs of files, it's going to go from something that could take minutes to hours. Now, the way to tell if you're using a relay server can actually sometimes be a little bit difficult. One of the easier ways to tell for mobile apps and things like that, other than Synology Drive Share Sync on a computer, is to go to your Quick Connect URL and see what it redirects to. So if you see something like this, your nas.us2.quickconnect.2, that means you are using a relay server. And that means you're going to have a very slow remote connection. But if you've got a DSM port open, and you can actually change this port to any arbitrary value and forward it on your router. Note, this does come with some security risks that I've actually got a video on that I'll leave a link down in the description below to. You'll actually see something like .direct.quickconnect.2, just like this. I'm on the local network, so we actually see the local IP address right here. But if I was remote and I saw this .direct.quickconnect.2, that would mean that I'm actually directly connected to my NAS over the internet. Now, if you're just using Synology Drive, all you have to do is port forward port 6690 TCP from your router to the NAS, which is actually very secure to do due to the fact that it is only used for that data transit. It's actually still going to use the Quick Connect for authentication with Synology, so it's a great kind of middleman with security, and that's probably what needs the most amount of performance. But that is all those things. I'll leave a link down to a port forwarding guide as well as just an overall security guide for that. But if you see a .direct.quickconnect.2, you know you've got the fastest possible remote connection. Another thing that is really critical that I'll add on here is global latency is very important. If you've got everything tuned properly and a very fast connection, you are going to have a much better experience if you're connecting to your NAS from the coffee shop 5 miles away than you are from 5 countries away. The further you are geographically from your NAS, the slower it is going to be because data can only travel at the speed of light. And especially if you're using something like a Starlink, that is going to be even slower because your data has to go all the way up to low Earth orbit and back to be able to get to your NAS. And so those are another case where it can be a lot slower. And now moving on to number 4, this is where internet speed starts to matter again. Because your upload speed, wherever the NAS is located, is going to be everyone else's download speed when downloading files off the NAS and vice versa. That's because whenever you are downloading a file from your NAS is uploading it to you. And so if you've got cable internet and you've got 1 gigabit down, Lovely. But maybe only 40 megabit up? That means you're only going to be able to download files at about 5 megabytes per second because your NAS can only upload as fast as your internet speed allows. And that's something that can really slow things down when you've got those really slow internet connections, especially if you're trying to send a lot of data. Upgrading to something like fiber can make a massive difference because fiber tends to be symmetric. That means your upload speed and your download speed tend to be the same. And so a 250 megabit symmetric connection, in my opinion, is far superior than a 1 gigabit connection with 40 megabit up for most people. All right, so that is number 4, realizing that your upload speed at your office or house may be the limiting factor. It's something a lot of people tend to forget. And finally, number 5 is maybe you just have to take the remote connection out of the equation. I work with a fair amount of accountants who have tax software that is just not designed to be accessed from people across a VPN connection. And people who are in the office will access the files in seconds. Whereas people who are remote may take 10, 20 seconds just to open a single file, which is unacceptably slow. A lot of software is just not written with this global latency and things like that in mind when they're designing it. So for those people, it can make a lot of sense to take the remote part of it out of the equation. And the same is true for video editors. So for just regular companies, you can actually just have an extra computer at the office where the NAS is and use remote desktop over a VPN to have your employees who are working remotely connect back to their desktops at the office, and boom, now they are opening the files from their desktop that's at the office 5 feet from the server. All your performance problems are gone because it's flipping the equation. Instead of having the data go all the way to their house and back every time they're doing any minute operation, now it's a lot simpler because they are just getting the video signal from the computer at the office. So the data only has to transfer to their local computer, and it is a huge difference. And no matter how much tuning and tweaking you do, in some cases, software is just not optimized for this remote connection. And look at having a setup where they can just remotely connect into a computer and then operate locally. For people who are just doing regular office things, just Windows Remote Desktop or macOS Remote Desktop both work phenomenally well. And unless you're video editing, you're not going to notice. But for people who are video editing or using Lightroom and really need accurate color and low frames per second and a lot more customization, my favorite software to use for this is Parsec. And that can make all the world of difference. And it's just something to check out. All right, well, that was number 5. We've gone over a ton of different ways to optimize how fast your NAS is in a lot of different use cases. If you'd like, you can hire me. There's a link for that down in the description below. I do this professionally, as you might have been able to tell. And if you have any questions, go ahead and put those down in the comments below. All right, well, have a good one. Bye.